Welcome everyone to another episode in the Perspective Drawing series. In this video we are going to look at how to create some grids in 1, 2 and 3 points perspective. If you are going to be drawing in perspective, then it's helpful to construct a grid that can assist you. Here I'm going to start by drawing out a grid in 1 point perspective. I place a vanishing point on the horizon line, and then I draw another horizontal line below that is parallel to the horizon, and then I divide this up. Now I take some lines from each of those points back to the vanishing point. Now the next step is to determine the depth of each grid unit. There is a more mechanical approach to creating precise grids in perspective, but I will be covering that much later in this series. For now I want to make these earlier videos easy to follow. Most of the time when you are drawing a grid like this, you will be eyeballing some measurements and making a good enough judgment. So here I'm going to draw a horizontal line, choosing a depth that feels right to me. We also need to consider the foreshortening, but next we determine the depth for the rest of the grid units, and to do this we use the duplication technique that I had covered in a previous episode. I take a line through the corners of these grid units and I extend this until it meets the horizon line. This gives me a right vanishing point which I can use to do the same with the rest of these grid units. I also do this in the opposite direction, which establishes a left vanishing point. Although as a result I have also created a 2 points perspective grid, I can use these lines to build the rest of the grid in 1 point perspective. Here you can see that these grid units diminish in size as they head into the distance, and now we have a 1 point perspective grid. You can now use this to draw in 1 point perspective. I'll quickly run through another example where I do the same as I just did, except this is going to be a vertical grid on the side. It's just another example of what you can do with this. So now let's take a look at creating some 2 points perspective grids. I'm going to start by establishing the horizon line, and now I am tasked with putting down 2 vanishing points. I'm going to place these apart from each other and bring some lines down from them both until they meet. I'm able to create what could be referred to as the ground plane or the edge of the grid that we are going to be dividing. I haven't included that back edge because the position of that will be decided when I start to divide the grid. So when it comes to dividing this up, I could go ahead and eyeball it in and repeat what we did in the previous example, but I'm going to show you another method, and it's similar to the technique that we covered in the episode on division. So from the point furthest away from the horizon, I'm going to create a horizontal line at any length as long as it's practical for the amount of divisions that you want. Now the reason why I have done this is because it's much easier to divide this parallel line than it is to divide one of these lines in perspective, because then we have to consider foreshortening, and it's something that we can avoid by doing this. So here I'm going to divide this up into equal sections. Again, it depends on how many grid units you want, but this will be fine for this example. And now I'm going to bring a line from the end of this parallel one which we just created to the other corner of the grid and extend it until it meets the horizon line, and that will give us a point that we can then use to divide that side of the grid. I simply bring my lines from those dividing points through the grid to that new point. Now we have these new dividing points on the grid that are foreshortened accurately, and I can bring a line from them to the left vanishing point. So now we can continue to build this grid. Again, I'm going to eyeball that grid unit and bring a line from the far side of the grid to the right vanishing point. Now after that, I repeat that duplication technique that we did in the previous example, and I'm able to construct the rest of this grid in 2 points perspective. So you can follow these steps when you want to create more 2 points perspective grids at different angles, and I think I'll do a follow-up video going over some other methods that can be put to use, but before we move on here, I'm just going to create some more grids and show you some further examples. So now let's create a 3 points perspective grid, and I have covered the basics of 3 points perspective in the past. We know that there are obviously 3 vanishing points, so I'm going to start by placing 2 of them apart on the horizon line, and now for the third one, we have the choice of placing this above or below the horizon. Just on a side note, you might sometimes see the point above the horizon line referred to as the zenith and the one below as the nadir. For this example, I'll be placing the third point below the horizon line, and most of the time when drawing in this perspective, the third point will be off the page. And so I'll talk about what you can do about that in a moment. For now, I'll just finish off this example by firstly creating a 2 point perspective grid as we did previously using the left and right vanishing points. So now we have to add another series of grid lines over this which are directed to that third vanishing point. I'm going to start by drawing a vertical line at that vanishing point and a horizontal line that is above and parallel to the horizon line, which I can divide up into sections. I then take some lines from each of these points to that vanishing point below. This gives me all of the necessary grid lines to draw in 3 points perspective. So let's take a look at what to do when that third vanishing point is off the page. Also, in a future video, I'll cover what to do when all the vanishing points are off the page, but for now, let's look at a 3 points perspective grid. So let's start off as usual with the horizon line and 2 vanishing points that are apart. Now I begin to cross some lines that extend from those vanishing points, and this is just to guide me when I start drawing in perspective. Now because I'm going to be drawing in 3 points perspective, I know that I will have to angle my lines towards the third vanishing point. In this case, let's say it's above the horizon line, far off into the distance. So as I start drawing here, I am estimating where that vanishing point would be, directing my lines towards it. Because it is far off into the distance, these lines are not angled too drastically, but you can still see that this is being drawn in 3 points perspective. Now you could continue to eyeball a direction of your lines, and that is fine if you are casually drawing freehand, but if you want a grid then you can start to build one as your drawing develops further. So right now I have this shape that I've been eyeballing, and now I'm going to use what I have here to create a more accurate grid for me to work onwards. So to do this, I start by estimating where a vertical line would be. So for this example, by looking at the angle of the lines that exist already, I'd say that it would be about here. I draw that in, and then I look at the other edges of these shapes and I extend one of them as well. So now we have a set distance between these lines, and that would continue to get smaller until these lines met at that third vanishing point. What I am going to do now is I'm going to create a horizontal line across these, and I can use this line as a means of dividing. So I will mark the halfway point and I will continue to half this until I'm happy with the amount of sections that I have. Now I am going to repeat this and create another dividing line below. This one will be larger in width because it's further away from the vanishing point, but I'll still continue to divide this in the same way. Now I will extend both of these dividing lines across and measure out some more divisions. Again, you could just eyeball this, but for the purpose of this tutorial, I'll just use a ruler. So now I'm going to draw some lines that connect these dividing points, and as a result, I am creating a grid that is equally divided. Now I'm able to correct the drawing if necessary and continue to draw in 3 points perspective. So we approach each of these perspective grids differently, but many of the techniques that I presented in this video have been covered in previous episodes and can be applied in other areas when drawing in perspective. To conclude this episode, I'm going to construct a 3 points perspective grid and create a drawing. Whilst this is in time-lapse, it should give you a better idea of how you can benefit from using grids like this. Also, I will be putting the real-time drawing footage for this example over on the Patreon page. As I said, I'm going to be making another video on the subject of grids before moving on, and then later in this series we will start to look at a more mechanical means of constructing grids. But with that being said, I hope you found this one helpful. If you have any questions, then be sure to comment them below. Also, if you want to take your studies further, then do consider checking out the Patreon page, because I create study documents which are essentially tutorials on paper. But other than that, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.